Secretary for Stewardship and Plan Giving at the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and I'm happy to be hosting this webinar. And beside me is
Janice Meehan, and I'm the Development Manager here in Stewardship and Plan Giving.
And this is our very first webinar. So we're going to ask and hope that there's some grace and that we don't run into too many technological difficulties. We're going to send you an email after the webinar that will have links to the handouts as well as the PowerPoint presentation, as well as give you an opportunity to evaluate it and give us tips and ideas for how we could make it better, what we could improve. We really are interested in your feedback so that we can make these as useful for you as possible. This has been an idea and a dream that we've wanted to do for quite some time. Janice and I both do workshops with congregations and presbyteries and different groups, and they're always saying, oh, we'd like to learn this, but we don't have the opportunity to go to all the congregations. So this is one way we're hoping that we can provide you some useful tidbits to use in your congregation. If you're wanting more information afterwards, feel free to contact us. We're here at the national office. Quick email or phone call away, and we'll try and provide you with more information or see what we can do to help. In the meantime, we're at 102, and there's 54 people who signed up, and we want to honor the people who signed up on time and have been able to get it working. So I want to introduce you to Lori Guenther Reesor, and Janice and I heard a presentation from Lori in the spring about the PhD research that she had done looking at generosity in congregations. We thought it was really interesting, and it might be something that you'd be interested in learning about as well. She's also helped to develop a generosity assessment tool for use in congregations, and we're looking to pilot this as a new project this fall. So you'll see that there's an opportunity to join us for another webinar if you're interested in learning about this tool and trying it out at your congregation. She'll say more about it in the webinar, but it's kind of a neat one that just looks at the number of people who are giving in your congregations and helps you understand what the giving patterns are there. So I think with that introduction, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Lori so she can start her presentation. We're really excited to see right now we're up to 54 participants, and we can see from the names that there's a number from across Canada, and so welcome to the first CPC Stewardship webinar. All right, Lori, take it over.
Okay. Can you hear me? I am sitting here in my house in Mississauga, and I'm really pleased to be here. I just feel this from the list of people coming in and working with Janice and Karen that grace abounds. So I'm delighted about that. I'm gonna, now that you get a sense of that, there's this lady sitting in Mississauga, I'm gonna switch it over to my presentation. I want to encourage you to type in your comments, and there'll be several times where I'll introduce, where Karen and Janice will be able to answer those questions. I'll read them out and I'll be able to answer them, because I really thrive on interacting with you all. In fact, I'm actually a person who talks with my hands, so a webinar will be an interesting format for me. So I'm super glad you're here, and I'm going to switch it over to my PowerPoint. I'm really hoping you're seeing my PowerPoint right now. Is that in fact the case?
We are seeing your PowerPoint. We're also seeing your web. There we go. Now we can see you. Just the PowerPoint, Lori. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So just to remind you all, we are the Presbyterian Church in Canada is sponsoring this, Building Generous Congregations, and it is indeed October 4th, 2017 already. Amazing. I want to introduce myself a little bit. If I don't know how many of you would recognize Lori Guenther Reesor as a double-barreled Mennonite name, but that is in fact who I am. However, I feel like I should be at least a little bit conversant with Presbyterians. I mean, you have Frederick Buechner, Anne Lamott, you have all the great writers, Kathleen Norris. I feel like I'm at least an honorary Presbyterian from the number of Presbyterians I've read. I studied math, which is an odd introduction perhaps to theology, but it served me well to have those kind of statistical skills. After I did my math degree, I did a Master of Theological Studies, where I specialized in Paul's collection for Jerusalem in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. I wasn't done with that topic, and after that, I did my Doctor of Ministry at Tyndale University College and Seminary in Toronto, where I did research. I toured Canada, as Karen has alluded to. I talked to donors from my own tribe and from other tribes, and I sat in church basements and heard stories and did surveys, and it was a wonderful opportunity to learn about Christian giving. And I posted my research on my website, which is lgreesor.com. So I'm a fundraising consultant. I've worked in churches and charities my whole career. I'm a number cruncher, a data analyst, a theologian, a poet, a donor, a board member, a former pastor, a wife, a mom, and a home canner. And this home canner is a surprisingly useful skill for research. Here you'll see my research tools, which is a jar of homemade salsa, a bag of nacho chips, and a survey. I would sit in a church basement and people would fill out the survey, and then we would talk when we would have chips, and we would talk. I would be sitting in Alberta and we'd be talking about what a great year it was for peppers in Ontario. And this is where I heard the most amazing and humbling stories of generous people and what makes them generous. And I'm still humbled and privileged to feel that I am a steward of these people's stories. And that's what motivates me to share the research that I've done, is to be able to share their stories. I've said this already, but please type in your questions and Janice or Karen will read them on your behalf during a break. So there'll be a couple of breaks and then of course at the end. Let me start with a bad poem. There once was a church, days in the past, whose members were all paid in cash. They passed round a plate, and things just seemed so great, but times they are changing so fast. I imagine that there's a variety of ages and backgrounds represented here today, but I think many of you will recognize that the giving patterns aren't what they used to be, and that people don't give in the same ways that they used to. Our context is changing a lot. I heard stories of people who grew up, say before World War II even, where they grew up watching their dad get paid in cash. And your dad would sit on the kitchen table and he would count out a pile of money for the church, and then he would count out a pile of money for the bills, and then he would count out if there was any money left. That would be where the money for other things came. Now, if you grow up like that, you don't need the church to teach you generosity because it's in your DNA. You learned it before you were 5. But for a lot of us, I'd say for almost all of us, times have changed and we do need the church to teach us about generosity. It's just not something that we learn by watching anymore. I believe that giving is a spiritual discipline like prayer. This isn't a terribly radical thing to say, I know. The Bible counsels us to pray regularly, and there's so many opportunities too for spontaneous prayer like help or thank you. And so too with giving. Paul counsels the Corinthians to give on a regular basis as God has blessed them, as God has prospered them. So we encourage people too to give on a regular basis, and there's so many opportunities for spontaneous giving. So it's a really parallel discipline, parallel spiritual discipline to prayer. We pray and we give both regularly and spontaneously. When we talk about a spiritual discipline, we think about what our theology of giving is. And there's 2 models that seem to be prevalent. There's more than 2, but I'll talk about the top 2. And one is what the psalmist has been proclaiming for a very long time: the abundance of a generous God. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, his mercies never come to an end. Where God's grace is limitless. Manna is an example of God's abundant grace, for some gathered much and some gathered little, but they shared and everyone had enough. I'm not preaching a prosperity gospel here where we're all driving around in a pink Cadillac, but that there is enough, that if we share, there is enough. contrast this to a very prevalent view of money, which is the scarcity mindset, that there's never enough. We might be singing about the steadfast love of the Lord never ceasing, but at church budget time, we often close the hymn book and we start being possessed by feeling that we don't have enough, and that that God isn't in fact enough. And I remind you again that this is a mindset, that it's not, the scarcity and the abundance isn't about how much we actually have. It's really at the glass half full or half empty. People in identical circumstances can either be terrified or thankful. It's how we respond. I said I'd done a lot of work with 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. And I'm grateful to the theologian James Dunn. Perhaps some of you have studied him. He's a very well-known New Testament theologian. And he looked at Paul's giving collection for Jerusalem and came up with, he says that it starts with God. And every good thing does start with God. At the top, God's grace flows to people. I think we can all say amen to that. God's grace flows to people. And then people, and that's us, have the opportunity to respond to God's grace with gracious action. And that's praying and helping and sharing and caring and giving money. All of these great things. And people, and that's us again, are also the recipients. In the collection for Jerusalem, the people in Jerusalem are so grateful, and they thank God for all their brothers and sisters and other congregations who've helped them. And this praise and thanksgiving flows to God, and God continues to be gracious. And it's just this wonderful circle of grace and gracious action and thanksgiving. And that's the model of giving that I believe is a great model. It's not the only model, but it's a great model to remind us that we're relying on grace and that we're relying on God. Gratitude, I put this in about the biggest font that I could possibly fit onto a slide. Gratitude is everything. It's so foundational. The church has the great opportunity to model the grateful giving that we're hoping to promote. And I might just say that again. The church has this tremendous opportunity to promote the grateful behavior, to be a model of grateful behavior. We want people to give in gratitude, and we can be this model of responding to God's grace with gratitude and thanksgiving. I'm going to take a pause here so that Janice or Karen can read off some questions, and I'll take an opportunity to respond to them.
So far, we don't see any questions that have been typed in. So if you want to keep going, then we'll keep going.
I will keep on going, yes. It's hard when I can't see you all. I will keep on going. So our goal here, as I hope is clear by the emphasis on giving as a spiritual practice, is that it's discipleship. I'm quoting from the Reverend Carl Travis here, and when I was working on these slides, I actually went back and thought, I think he's a Presbyterian. Indeed he is. He's from First Presbyterian Church in Fort Worth, Texas. And I went to one of his webinars on giving, and he reminds us all, which I think we keep needing to hear over and over, and that our goal here is to produce more generous disciples of Jesus Christ. More money for the church is a nice secondary outcome, but our goal here is generous discipleship, and that will lead to money for the church.
Here's a question, Lori. So when you say the church, do you mean the church institution or individual?
The church, or more money for the congregational, like for the congregation. So more money for the church budget to do what God is calling them to do in God's kingdom.
Oh yeah, but I think the question, I think people just took a minute to type their questions in. So when you've been talking about the church, and you said the church can model gratitude, and the church, are you talking about the church institution or individuals in the church?
Oh, both. I hope that individuals make up the church, but the church collectively, I guess I would start with the structure of the church, with the worship planners and the leadership and the presbytery. All of those structures we can start by being grateful, and then we want to encourage the individuals in the church to be grateful. But there's no reason that you can't start with both.
And can you give any examples of how the church can model gratitude?
Yes, the church could send out a thank you letter with a receipt. The church could say thank you in the offering, say, I thank God for all the generous people who teach Sunday school and give money to keep the lights on in the Sunday school classroom. Oh yes, there's a really excellent book by J. Christopher, Not Your Parents' Offering Plate, which goes on in some detail about many of these things. But yes, there's 1,001 ways to be grateful, and every day is a new opportunity. I could go on about that for a long time if you'd like.
We'll let you continue your presentation, and if anyone's interested in a book review on the Not Your Parents' Offering Plate, they can check out the last Presbyterian Connection newspaper, and there's one written by Janet.
Ha, there you go. Nice synchronicity there.
So go ahead, continue.
Okay, so we talked that things are changing and that it seems to be that we have to teach generosity. And when did this change exactly happen? I would say it's baby boomers, and blame might not be the right word, but when I did my research, I asked people, are giving habits changing over time? And I also asked people how old they were. Now, if people who are under 35, so say you were born in the 80s, you don't see giving habits changing because the change already happened before you. If you're sort of in the middle between 35 and 64, you're saying, well, yeah, giving habits have sort of changed, but again, you're part of the change, so you don't really see the before and after. But people who were older than 65, oh my goodness, they just said, oh yeah, giving habits are changing. There wasn't any doubt in their minds. So this isn't just me. A lot of my research was trying to validate things that I'd seen in other studies. So Reginald Bibby out of University in Calgary, I believe, somewhere in Alberta, he has done some of the same research into giving patterns and says, yes, baby boomers are definitely where the change happened, where people just didn't automatically give money to their church anymore.
Lori, maybe you can just say where you did your research, because I think that people will be interested to hear that you've done this with Canadian congregations.
Yes, I was sponsored by what at the time was called Mennonite Foundation of Canada, and that was called Abundance, because they don't work with just specifically one denomination. And so I did with Mennonite churches of different stripes, as well as Evangelical Missionary Church. There were 7 different ones. I'm going to struggle a bit to give you the whole list, but it was a variety of congregations from British Columbia to Ontario. And also I talk about that once people know that I am interested in this, I talk about church giving with Anglicans, Lutherans, people of every stripe. It's my obsession / passion.
Thanks. Keep going.
All right, you will now see in front of you a picture of a cow. I have been talking about cows and horses for a while now when it comes to describing givers. If you think about cows do not need a lot of training. If your grandmother was a cow and your mother was a cow, you sort of know the drill and you do what everyone else does and you wander into the barn. And cows are very loyal, are a model for our very loyal donors. They give in response to need and duty and obligation. And if you could imagine how old the donors are that are sort of fitting more into this model, it would be your older donors. It's a duty, and we don't talk about it because it's a duty, it's need. And my research suggests, as well as other research that's been done by Stats Canada, that this is how some of our older donors are motivated to give in response to need and duty and obligation, that is not how our younger donors, and by younger I really mean baby boomers and younger, this is not how they're motivated to give. They approach giving differently. So we have our cows who give in response to need and as a duty, and that's wow, those are great and loyal donors. It's not how most people are motivated to give anymore. In reality, much more of our donors are horses. I'm not a horse farmer. As I said, I live in Mississauga, but I picture the movies where the jockey sits on the horse and whispers into the horse's ear and they point towards the finish line and the jockey or the rider strokes the horse. There's a lot of training that goes into developing a good horse. A horse is not born knowing how to run the Kentucky Derby. You have to train them quite a bit. You have to have a connection with that horse. You have to say what the goal is. There's vision. There's a lot of discipling, dare I say, discipleship that goes into training a horse. And that's where I think our givers are, is that we need to be so much more intentional. We can't assume that our donors are like cows who sort of got the tithing memo and then we don't need to do anything more. Our donors are actually like horses, where there's a lot of trust that needs to be established, where we need to build that connection, where we need to share what our vision is. Why are we doing this? What happens when we give? So horses versus cows, that's how I describe the shift, is that the church often acts as if our donors were cows who know what to do, when in fact our donors are much more likely to be horses who need a lot of training and encouragement. Trust is foundational for both horses and cows. If we don't have trust, nothing's going to happen. That's when I started doing this research. There was Canadian research conducted by the Matar Foundation that suggested that even among people who attend church every week, they trust their local congregation much more than they trust anything else. And I wanted to see if those findings held true among the congregations that I studied, and they absolutely do. I want to show you the next graph. So this little dartboard, if you will, is talking about trust. And the point of this drawing is to show you that trust is strongest with the local church. So that red in the center, that's the trust in the local church, and people trusted that the most. But across the board, everywhere I went, they trusted the local church the most. And they trusted the local church the most because they were familiar with it. Not because they thought the church was efficient or because they even really shared the same values as their church, but it was familiar. They trusted their denomination less for the most part. Now, I need to say that there's a real range of responses. You could have people sitting in the same room who go to the same church, and one person would say, oh, I trust the denomination like I trust my own church. And the person next to them would say, that's sending money to a black hole. I have no idea what would happen if I sent money to my denomination. So there's a huge range, obviously. But for the most part, people trusted their church the most. They trusted their denomination less so. And then a charity that was affiliated with their denomination, they generally trusted less. And then other Christian charities, even less. And then secular charities, the further away you get from your local church, the less trust there was. Denominationally affiliated charities can vary too, of course. If you have a mission worker and Justin and Megan grew up in your church and they are serving with an organization, you're liable to trust that organization, whether it be a Presbyterian or Baptist or Send or whatever it is. So if there's some kind of connection with a person, that affects things quite a bit. So I guess the takeaway that I would want to say for this slide here is that people trust the local church the most because it's familiar. I don't know if we had to do this slide in 10 or 20 years when people don't go to church as often and they're maybe not as familiar with their local church. I don't know what's going to happen. But right now, people trust the local church the most.
Do you find that trust translates into generous giving?
Absolutely, yes. The people who give to their denomination are the people who trust their denomination a lot, not just some, but people who trust the denomination a lot are the people who give. Yes, that's an excellent question. It's the same. No trust means no giving.
And this would be the same at the congregational level. So if you're not trusting that your congregation or that those that are looking after the money are doing the best for the congregation with it, then there's the lack of trust and they may not give as much. Is that correct?
I only surveyed givers. I would love to be able to go back and look at people who didn't give, because that's how you'd answer that question the best, if you know what I mean. So my research, I think this is the first presentation I've done where I didn't talk about non-response bias because it seemed an awfully technical term. But I had the keeners coming out to my research. So these are the people that are willing to come listen to some academic from Ontario ask them questions about giving. So I think that the situation with trust is probably even much more dire than what I've described it, because these are the true believers that came out to the focus groups. I wish I could answer exactly how people who don't give feel, but I don't have a data on that.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll let you continue on. If people have questions, continue to type them in at any time, and Janet and I will share them.
Okay. All right. Like I said, I've done workshops to a variety of groups, and I wish I could have a show of hands to see if there's any church treasurers in the room, because church treasurers always get this slide first. And that is the 80-20 rule of church giving. You can see the little people, the light green people give a large slice of the pie, and the rest of the dark green people give a smaller slice of the pie. Now, this isn't an exact science. I'm not trying to say that it's exactly going to be 80-20. What I'm trying to say is that it is often the case that there's a small group of givers who are providing the bulk of the funding in your church. If there was one takeaway that I'd want to give for pastors here, well, there's lots of takeaways, but one very useful takeaway would be ask your treasurer, are we a couple of funerals away from disaster in our church? And just see. It would be great to talk to your treasurer and say, you know, this lady was saying this crazy stuff that there might be a few people that are doing the most of the giving. Is this possibly true? And ask your treasurer. I think that would be a great conversation. Now, there's not been good research done on this in Canada, not that I know of anyway, but about 20 years ago, in a book, reference in a book called Passing the Plate, 20% of self-identified American Christians, so these are people who said they were Christian, do not give any money to their church at all, the big goose egg. So if we go back to our graph again, you can see that there's 20% that give 80% of the money, but then we should really cross a couple of those people off altogether because they're not giving at all.
Lori, just to let you know, a couple of treasurers, Debbie and Bernadette, have confirmed that what you're saying is true.
Thank you, Debbie and Bernadette. Like I said, it's always the church treasurers who nod to that slide first. So I've been sharing this research with a variety of Christians, leadership and otherwise, and some people have actually suggested that that 20% figure is a little bit on the low side, and that maybe it's closer to 40%. And I know there's no hard and fast numbers on this, but I have definitely seen a congregation that looked exactly like what I'm describing to you, where the 20% is doing the bulk of the giving. There's about 40% of the people that are doing the rest of the giving, and then there's a large part of the congregation that aren't giving very negligibly. And of course, it depends how you define who's a member and who's on board. But this is what what's been suggested to me by some fairly reputable sources as of late, that the situation could be worse than what the statistics, those old statistics, are telling us. On the plus side, there's lots of opportunity for discipleship training, and that is what we are about, right? So that there is definitely a silver lining. Statistics Canada did something called the Canadian
Oh, we've lost you. Oh, Lori, you back?
I'm still talking.
Okay, can you go back? Can you go back to Statistics Canada said, because you disappeared for a few minutes.
Oh dear.
We do have a question. Do graphs that show a breakdown of contributions work? Like so many donors giving XXX and the number of donors giving XX. Do they work to help motivate people to give?
Yes. I mean, you have to be careful and respectful of how you do that. So I don't want to make a blanket statement, but the more transparent we can be about our giving and not hiding it, secrecy does not help. That is, I'm certain of that. So the more we can talk about it and be thankful for what God is doing, oh yeah, that is a good thing.
This is Karen. I think that the graphs could also help the leadership to know what the giving patterns are in their church. And then if they want to try new things, you could watch and see how things change. So you could start a baseline and create it and then say, I think a lot of people won't necessarily give, or they don't give as generously out of guilt. They give in response to compassion and being motivated by seeing what the church will do as opposed to knowing what other people give. But it can be a tidbit of information some people will respond to, and it can especially be helpful for the leaders of your congregation to know, not the people, just the sort of general trends in their congregation and what's going on. Over to you, Lori.
So Statistics Canada keeps track of charitable giving. They don't keep track of it as well as I would like them to, but they do. They've done an annual, a study called the Canadian Survey of Giving, Volunteering, and Participating every 3 years. They've recently changed the name, but they still look at people who claim charitable receipts on their income tax. So the latest numbers show that about 10% of donors, and that's about 5% of the population, gave 66% of all donations by the total value of money. So that is it's very concentrated. And the charitable giving in terms of the total dollars is in fact going up year over year, but it's not because more people are giving, it's because these primary donors, these top donors, are giving more. So the trend is that fewer donors are giving more. Those donors tend to be the older people. So what then do we do? I think it's important to recognize and to go, I maybe should add a gratitude slide in here, to be grateful that our churches continue and that we continue to be a place to worship God and not to get frozen in fear and anxiety. That's not what I'm trying to say at all, even though the numbers might be a little bit scary. We have a generous God who gives us everything we need, and we have an opportunity to share that around. So there's lots of things that we can do. If I had to tweet out this as 140 characters or whatever, I would say thank you, tell stories, and pay attention. So in the previous question or so was talking about, does it help to know what the patterns are? I think it does help to pay attention to what's going on and who gives and who doesn't give, and to know what those general trends are. There's a great video that Abundance has that I should get permission to share with you that talks about someone where the pastor knows everything about the person. They know whether their son or daughter has been in jail. They know about drugs, births, deaths, all kinds of things. And then all of a sudden, money seems to be something terrifying. But it's funny to think that we have it's a real taboo, but I'm not sure why. So we should pay attention to giving, and whether that's going to be individually or knowing what the patterns are. And there's going to be a generosity assessment tool presentation in a couple of weeks, another webinar to talk about a way that we can say, hey, how do we actually measure what's going on in our church? So let's pay attention. Telling stories is another webinar that's going to be happening in November. That's going to be a specific focus on budgeting and telling stories in a budget. Lots of people don't understand budget as columns of numbers, but people respond to stories. So telling stories is a great way to start. And saying thank you is foundational. There's going to be a webinar on that in December. They're all my favorite, but saying thank you is so easy. That's something that you could do today. You could send a card to someone or phone them or email them, tweet them, whatever. Say, I am so glad that you're part of this church and for what you do. That's a great one, and it's an easy one in some ways. So that's the very short form of where I would say churches could go in thinking about what the generosity journey is going to be.
Okay, we've got some questions for you, some questions and some comments. So one comment is that our Board of Governors chair just made a breakdown of the giving by $5 increments and has the objective of encouraging people to move up a bracket. Have you found that worked?
I think I wouldn't want to just say up a bracket without saying what great things God is doing in our church. So that it would be that's a both and thing. Like a lot of churches with pre-authorized giving, sometimes they've set those up years ago, and so the people are faithfully giving whatever amount of money it is a month, bless them. But they've never gotten a letter to say, it's time to maybe move to reconsider. Is God prospering you in a different way now than God was prospering you 5 years ago? So for sure, that we should be asking people to look at that. Yep. And we should also be telling the stories of the great things that's happening when you give to our church and what happens. So when pastors say, well, what story should I say? I usually start with Tuesday for some reason. I say, so what happens at your church on Tuesdays? And they'll say, oh, well, it's a seniors lunch, or the AA meets in the basement, or maybe Tuesday someone phoned you and you had this long pastoral phone call. You don't have to give the details, but you can just share. I am so grateful for this church, because on Tuesday I had this phone call from a single mom, and I can't tell you the details, but I can tell you that God was, that this was an opportunity for us to share the love of God with this person. So we're so grateful that you're giving to this church, because that you're the, then God, God works through us. So there's wonderful stories that we can share. They don't have to be big; they just have to be real. That was a very long answer to a short question.
That's great. Another question is, does anyone here attend a church that has openness about the giving in the plate? And then another comment was, what do you mean by openness? So are there people out there, or even if, Lori, you want to comment about what it means to be open about what happens with the giving plate?
Wow, I think that the more that we can convert it to stories instead of a column of numbers, because a lot of people do not understand those columns of numbers and all, and they're too terrified to say they don't understand it, because they've not understood it for the past 10 or 20 years, and they just are too frightened to speak up now. But if just the basic stories of, oh yeah, like the church pays the bills, and sometimes we think of all these things like the building and salaries and the utility bill is just sort of overhead, and the mission is only the stuff that we send overseas. And I sincerely hope that's not the case. I hope that when we give money to First Presbyterian in Fort Worth or Halifax or Saskatoon or wherever you are, that it's an opportunity for people to gather and praise God. And just those ordinary stories that we can share that say, hey, when you give money to this church, this is what we do. Just to remind us of those basic and ordinary and wonderful things that God keeps doing.
So I wanted to go back to a point that you talked about earlier in the slides when you were talking about the difference between horses and cows. And I think that you were trying to suggest that discipleship and teaching about giving and generosity and what you do with your money and how it reflects your life is an important message the church can share with the people who are attending there. And so that's one thing that we can do. And then the other is just to help people connect with what they give to what it actually does, so that they can see how it's helping them participate in the mission and ministry of God, and how people's lives are being transformed.
Yes, absolutely. Like the model the cow model that might have worked 60 years ago, where people gave because you gave, and your grandmother went to this church and she gave, and there's that sort of this loyalty, this tremendous institutional loyalty. We still have donors like that, bless their hearts, but really that trust and that loyalty has to be earned. Show me that the charity that is setting the bar the highest in this regard is a charity called Charity Water, where if you give them money to build a well, you actually see the well, like you see a webcam of the well being built, and they don't ask you for money until they've shown that happening. So that's how the loop is being closed all around us, where people can literally see what's happening. And we have even better stories to tell. We just need to tell them.
Got a question from Knox Presbyterian. How do we help make people aware of how much is being given without laying a negative guilt trip on the ones who aren't giving as much?
by being thankful for time, talent, and energy. The we have such excellent teaching. Like I've spent, I can't imagine how many years of my life I've spent with the Apostle Paul at this point, where it's as God has prospered you. So it's, I mean, the widow's mite, they were rejoicing in a very small gift of great dedication. So when it's proportional giving that we want to celebrate, and we want to be able to encourage, celebrate in the number of givers that we have rather than in the amount of money that we're getting. How many generous disciples do we have? So that's something we're paying attention helps too, is how many people are giving. And if we have more people giving, that's something to be really grateful for, regardless of how much these people are able to give.
I'm going to share a few comments. So Gwen says, our congregation just worked with a copywriter to prepare 4 bulletin inserts reflecting stories of generosity from within our congregation. That sounds like a great idea, Gwen. And I think that's, it's been successfully seen before that sharing stories of generosity within the congregation helps people identify with it. Shannon says, because most of my congregation are low-income families, many living below the poverty line, as well as because of the previous bad experiences with pressured or legalistic giving, our elders completely avoid talking about money or giving. And this question, in your research, did you find out what created trust in the local church?
It's connection. It's the human connection, the relationships, and that's where, like I also used to work for World Vision, and lots of people are familiar with that, and lots of people support that. And the churches can say, well, we can't compete with them. They have all kind of resources there on TV. And I want to say, but you're in the church. You're worshiping together with these people. You shake their hand. So the churches have this rich human connection. We worship God together. That is pretty powerful. And so we have a great opportunity, responsibility, I don't know what you would want to call it, to build trust. That's part of discipleship. It's not just part of generosity, but all the things that we do to build one another up are building trust.
There's just a few other comments. Shannon went on to say that their folks in general, even though they're from low income, they're generous. There's a few who don't give, but when they believe in what the church is doing and its mission, not just ministry, which isn't the same thing, then they support it. And they were talking also about sharing not numbers, but stories. That can really help encourage generosity. Show pictures was another suggestion. Now, here's a good question for you, Lori, because I've heard you talk about it before. Do you believe that the treasurer should advise the pastor when they see a large drop-off in donations from particular individuals, since this may indicate other issues within the family?
Oh my goodness, how much time do you have, Karen? I could, yes, I do believe that, and I believe that strongly. I do another workshop called Best Practices for Giving in Churches, and it's a story. It's a story of Peach Blossom Church. It's a fictional congregation, but it's made up all of anecdotes that are real. And so I'm almost tearing up. I feel very strongly about this. I remember a conversation with the treasurer that I had, where the treasurer was the only person who knew when someone was going to leave the church, because the giving goes before the people do. And that could be a divorce, it could be a job loss. It's a strong ministry opportunity, an opportunity to reach out with the love of God to these people, and to not advise the pastor of that it's just sad, really.
We have a handout that's online that talks about that. It's an article, and we'll include the link and information when we send a follow-up email to all participants.
Yeah, I mean, I think marriages, I think marriages could be saved. I mean, that's not the only reason people stop giving, but yeah, I definitely think that the pastor should be informed, or when people start as well. Are there any other questions you want to address, or should I keep on trucking here?
Yeah, I think you can keep going. I'll just say Debbie has agreed that yes, treasurers should work with the minister or pastor and office staff and elders about problems. But we'll let you keep going. I think we've covered the questions that have been typed in so far.
Yes, well, there's not too much to, we're getting there. We're getting there. This has been great, by the way. I really appreciate that people are sharing and offering stories from their own experiences, because that's how we learn. So I talked about the be thankful, pay attention, tell stories as being my advice in a nutshell. And the tools that we can use to do that are many. This is 5. There's many more. I want to start by saying that Janice or Karen are great resources about these things and many other things. So please reach out to them. They can help. You don't have to know everything. I know that there's this kind of myth that pastors are supposed to know everything, but the grace abounds. So the offering is a great opportunity to be thankful and to say, we're so grateful because this offering helps us to buy goldfish for children's nursery school, or keeps the lights on for the AA meetings, or there's all kinds of just the ordinary wonderful things that are happening. Is an opportunity to be grateful for them. So the offering, it shouldn't just be kind of a cursory pass the plate thing. It's a great opportunity to be grateful and to tell stories. Online giving, I actually can quote scripture to support this, and I don't, but I won't. But online giving is, if we want someone to do something, let's make it easy. Pre-authorized giving, ditto. If we want someone to do something, let's make it easy. Planned giving too is something that I believe that Janice can help you with in particular, but how can we remember the church in our will? What a tremendous opportunity, and it's not something that we want to neglect. It sounds scary to talk about death, but it's a wonderful opportunity for people to be generous, or one final act of kindness is what I call it. One final act of kindness. Narrative budgeting is the next webinar that we're doing, and it's talking about telling our stories, because people aren't inspired by budget lines. People are inspired by stories. So let me put these tools in a way that's a little more actionable. A number of the webinars line up here. So there's going to be a Power of Digital Giving webinar in November. There's going to be a Planned Giving webinar in January. And as we've already said, I think, there's going to be a Narrative Budgeting webinar in November. So there's some opportunities.
Oh, this is Karen again, and I'll just do the little plug for the online giving. We've been developing some new resources and collecting some new tools that will make it easier for churches to start their own online giving. As we've been talking to congregations across Canada, we've been finding that very few have a donate button on their website, and yet the ones that have tell us that they're surprised by people who will give online. Maybe somebody will send a child to the Vacation Bible School and then think, oh, I wouldn't mind giving something to the church, and at year end, they go and give online, or they hear a response to a need and they give online. So we're excited about these new resources that are coming out.
Indeed.
Go ahead.
So we're on a home stretch here. I wanted to explain a little bit about the generosity assessment. It's going to be an upcoming webinar in, I think, 3 weeks' time. So what is a generosity assessment? It's been my experience that congregations get so caught up in the day-to-day finances that they can't see the forest for the trees. I mean, we're often scrambling, and we can't sort of step back and see what's really going on here. And a generosity assessment is a chance to, climb a hill and look out at the forest instead of just looking at the trees. So have you ever wondered, how does giving at our church compare to other congregations? Are we normal? And I realize that normal isn't always necessarily good, but how do we compare? Does the 80-20 rule apply to our church too? Who gives the most? And by who gives the most, I don't mean to say, hey, can we name that person? I mean, what kind of person gives the most? What age range gives the most? Are we cultivating younger givers to become mature givers? That's a huge question. How many young families would it take to replace one 80-year-old matriarch or patriarch of the church? How can our congregation become more intentional and effective in nurturing generosity? These are all pretty huge questions. A generosity assessment is looking at your giving numbers and just taking a little bit of a snapshot. And it would, like has been mentioned already, it'd be a wonderful opportunity to do this and then to take some stewardship steps, some steps in your stewardship journey, and then do a generosity assessment in a year or two and see what has changed. So I won't explain, I don't need to go on and on about it because there will be a webinar, but I wanted to give you a bit of a heads up of what that is going to be about. And this is a tool that the Presbyterian Church of Canada is going to be using. And I wanted to also give another opportunity for questions.
There was about the online giving. There was a few questions about what platforms are being suggested, and we've been investigating a number of platforms, including Canada Helps as well as Tidely, which is one out of the U.S. Canada Helps is only through credit cards, though I think they're developing debit as well. And anyway, we're going to just give you some breakdowns on what the costs are, what the benefits are, and how easy it is for your congregation to sign up. So we'll be looking at actual specific examples so that your church could try some online giving. We've looked at other types, but done some assessments. So that'll be coming. Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions? We're just looking to see if we've missed anything. Do you have any feelings? This was a question that could be asked later, but I think people might know. Do you have any ideas about people giving with their credit card? Do you feel that means people go into debt, and what does that mean? Or is there any teaching on sort of personal financial resources that can help people, or the church could do?
Yes, there are. I am partial myself because I'm most familiar with it, going back to the trust and familiarity piece with abundance, but I'm sure that you have resources that you would recommend too, where someone can actually come into the church and meet with people and talk. Because I mean, if people are in debt, that is a very big thing. And that's another thing where if people stop giving, we really need to know, because that could be facing some kind of a very serious debt issue as well. So the more we talk about money, the more that we can be open and also acknowledge that it's a tough one, and that money can create all kinds of problems for us. So rather than pretending that money doesn't exist or financial problems don't exist, the more we can be open about it in every single way, the better.
Some of the research we saw that came out of the United Church a couple of years ago were that churches who did personal financial seminars and help people get control of their own finances in a way that was biblically modeled and not in a judgmental way, but giving them skills and tools, saw in generosity increase at their congregations. But that's not the motivation for doing it. It's about reaching people and helping them to get control of their finances.
Right, so that they might have life and have it abundantly. I mean, it's just like prayer. If people were in a really struggling, we would want to come on board and help and pray for them and help them learn to pray. So in my mind, it's exactly the same. If someone's in financial difficulty, we'd want to offer them the opportunity we'd want to come alongside. Yeah.
We've had one technical question that we're just going to answer here, which is about the presentation, the PowerPoint presentation. The document, the PDF, will be up on the webinar website for the church, and we are recording this webinar, so all of the webinars, it's our intention to record them so that then the links are available and they can be shared.
Have you ever heard of do you know anything about Christians Against Poverty or Christians Against Poverty money courses? Have you heard about them?
I am familiar with Christians Against Poverty. I haven't, I couldn't give an endorsement of their course because I'm not familiar with it. I think it's, yeah, I think it would be something that, I don't know where your denomination is at with that, but you want to make sure that you want to ask some theological questions before you jump into it, what I say or anyone else says, and make sure that that theology is something that you share.
Here's another question. So who tells the stories of generosity? Is this another task for the pastor or something the board or finance committee should be encouraged to do?
Oh my, that is an excellent question. I hope everybody, I think the finance chair or whatever, however that role is named, wouldn't that be delightful instead of just having the job of getting up at the end of the year and begging for money, if they could share stories of generosity? Testimonies here are wonderful. If you can get testimonies of different people of different ages, sharing why they give and how giving has helped their faith. A testimony from an ordinary person in your church is worth 1,000 pamphlets.
Absolutely. And we have one other comment that at this church, the board believes that it is the duty of the elders also to tell the stories of generosity.
All right, so we're now at 1:57 and we wanted to keep the webinar to an hour. Just an encouraging message that comes from Debbie, who I think was one of our treasurers, she was thankful and blessed to have this webinar today. Thank you for organizing it. Thanks for your presentation, Lori. It was really informative. We look forward to continuing to provide these webinars. As we said, we'll send an email. Will it have an evaluation? It'll have links. We're looking for ideas of topics that you'd like to see in the future. So communicate back with us. Yeah. Oh, Lori, what were the Corinthian chapters that you did your research on?
2 Corinthians 8 and 9.
Chapters 8 and 9.
And 1 Corinthians 16, 1 to 4 is also worth checking out.
Great. Great.
So thanks again for joining us. We hope that if any of you would like to pilot this generosity assessment tool, it's fairly easy. It looks just at your numbers. We give you an Excel document. It'll print out the reports and it'll help you just see what is going on in your congregation. Most importantly, it could provide a baseline if you're thinking of trying new things and see if they actually work.
And attend the webinar on the 25th of October to find out more about that.
And if you can't attend, watch it online later. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.